The cafe was a cozy, sunlit haven in the middle of the bustling city, the kind of place where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of baked bread. Wooden tables bore the scratches and stains of decades of use, each telling a story of hurried breakfasts and lingering conversations. An elderly waitress, Margaret, moved with careful grace between the tables, her hands steady despite the years that had left her shoulders slightly stooped and her knees achingly stiff. Her apron, frayed at the edges, was a badge of decades of service, a silent testament to a life spent caring for strangers. At a corner table sat a young man who seemed to exist in a different world entirely. His designer jacket was unbuttoned just enough to reveal a crisp shirt, and the expensive sneakers on his feet were spotless, gleaming under the cafe's soft lights. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the table, his phone held like a lifeline. Every few seconds, he let out an exaggerated sigh, muttering complaints under his breath that carried an edge of entitlement. When Margaret approached to take his order, he didn't look up, speaking without warmth or acknowledgement. "Make it quick. I don't have all day." Margaret forced a polite smile, a practiced mask she had worn countless times over the years. She jotted down his order, trying to ignore the bitterness that prickled at her skin. As she turned away, her steps measured and calm, the young man muttered loudly enough for her to hear, "Typical slow old people." His words hung in the air like a slap, cutting deeper than any physical gesture. In a moment of reckless arrogance, he spat toward her back, smirking as if he had performed a daring feat. The spit landed on the hem of her apron, a small but humiliating mark that seemed to amplify the years she had devoted to this work. Margaret stood perfectly still, shock mingling with a quiet, simmering anger. Around them, other patrons glanced over, their expressions ranging from disbelief to discomfort, but no one moved to intervene. Outside, the roar of motorcycles faded into a low hum as a group of bikers parked along the curb, their engines slowly cooling. Leather jackets, tattoos, and chrome gleamed under the afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the polished city around them. They had been riding for hours, the kind of freedom only the open road could offer, and a cafe stop was their ritual: coffee, a quick bite, and a moment to share stories before heading out again. From their seats on the bikes, their eyes wandered toward the cafe's large windows, scanning the scene inside. At first, they only saw a typical afternoon crowd, people chatting, sipping coffee, a few working on laptops. But then one of them, Big Mike, leaned forward slightly, squinting. "Hold up. Look at that kid in the corner," he muttered, pointing toward the glass. The group's attention shifted. Behind the glass, they saw the young man, dressed in his designer clothes, tapping impatiently on his phone, sighing in exaggerated frustration. And then, like a spark igniting dry kindling, they saw it, the spit. The young man had spat toward the elderly waitress as she moved away from his table, smirking in blatant disrespect. Margaret's face, a mix of shock and quiet dignity, was framed by the sunlight, highlighting every line of her weathered but proud expression. Silence fell for a moment among the bikers. They had witnessed rudeness before, sure, but this was a level of cruelty that felt personal, even from behind the safety of glass. Big Mike's jaw tightened. "That kid just crossed the wrong line," he said, his voice low but firm. The others shifted in their seats, leather creaking, muscles tensing. There was an unspoken code among them: people who mistreated the vulnerable, especially the elderly, would face consequences. They watched the scene play out a few more seconds, the young man oblivious, laughing at something on his phone, smug and untouchable in his bubble of privilege. But the bikers didn't need him to know they were coming. The tension built like a storm on the horizon, quiet yet impossible to ignore. The cafe door swung open with a low, commanding creak, and immediately the chatter inside faltered. Heads turned, cups paused mid-air, and all eyes followed the entrance. The bikers stepped in, filling the doorway with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Leather jackets, chrome-studded gloves, and weathered faces told a story of experience and authority. Even the young man, who had been absorbed in his phone, sensed the shift instantly. Big Mike led the group, his tall frame and graying beard giving him an almost intimidating gravitas. He moved slowly, deliberately, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. The young man's smirk faltered, his fingers frozen on the sleek phone screen. Guys, it was just a joke," he stammered, voice trembling despite his best effort to sound casual. His carefully curated composure began to crumble under the silent weight of judgment emanating from the bikers. Margaret watched from a few steps away, her hands gripping the edge of a table, a mix of fear and relief washing over her. She had spent decades serving strangers, enduring rude comments, hasty complaints, even occasional insults, but she had never witnessed someone so openly vile, so recklessly arrogant. And now, seeing the bikers, imposing figures, she felt the first hint of justice in a world that often ignored such cruelty. The young man's eyes darted nervously between Big Mike and the other bikers, realizing belatedly that privilege and wealth were no shields here. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the silence stretched, each second amplifying his anxiety. I didn't mean, he began, but no words were necessary. Big Mike raised a hand, not in anger, but in calm authority, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Jokes are for friends. Respect is for everyone, Big Mike said, his voice low but carrying through the cafe with unmistakable clarity. Each word hit the young man like a cold gust of wind, leaving him frozen in place. The bikers flanked him subtly, their presence alone enough to communicate that this was not an idle warning. Other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension but unwilling to intervene, caught between awe and fear. The young man's phone slipped from his trembling hands and clattered against the wooden floor, breaking the spell for a brief second. He bent to pick it up, but Big Mike's gaze held him still, unwavering. Margaret exhaled slowly, relief softening her posture, as the confrontation needed no further escalation. The tension in the cafe began to ease as the bikers slowly backed away, their presence still commanding, but their purpose fulfilled. The young man remained frozen in his seat, staring down at the floor where his phone lay abandoned. The smug arrogance that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of shame and fear. Every flicker of confidence had been stripped away, leaving only the stark realization of his actions. He couldn't ignore the judgment in the eyes of the bikers, the silent disapproval of the other patrons, and, most of all, the quiet dignity of Margaret. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands now steady on her tray, and approached the table cautiously. "Sir," she said softly but firmly, "this is a place where people are treated with respect. I hope you understand that now." Her voice carried no anger, only a quiet authority, and the young man flinched at its calm strength. He opened his mouth, but no words came, and even if they had, he would have found them hollow. Outside, the rumble of the bikers, motorcycles returned as they mounted and drove away, leaving a trail of dust and a lingering sense of justice. Inside, the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the incident had left an indelible mark on everyone present. Conversations resumed, cups were refilled, but a subtle reverence lingered in the air, a reminder that respect was not something to be taken lightly. The young man finally lifted his gaze to Margaret. His eyes, once full of arrogance, now reflected a dawning humility. I'm sorry," he muttered, voice barely audible. Margaret nodded slightly, accepting the apology without words. It wasn't about punishment, it was about acknowledgement, about seeing the humanity in others and recognizing that every action had consequences. As she moved on to serve other tables, she felt a lightness she hadn't expected. The day's tension had transformed into quiet triumph, not through confrontation, but through the unwavering presence of those who refused to tolerate cruelty. The young man sat in silence, the weight of the lesson pressing heavily upon him. He had entered the cafe as someone untouchable, privileged, and dismissive, but he left changed, humbled, aware, and perhaps, for the first time, seeing the world through eyes other than his own. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street. The cafe remained a small beacon of civility in the chaotic city, a place where respect had been defended, and where even the youngest arrogance could be tempered by the quiet strength of experience.